there are no rules. The shapes are what you make. You know, the greenway is an idea, the high line is an idea, the waterline is an idea. It comes from connecting dots, joining up ideas, creating a momentum, building a club that everyone can belong to. And then say people, the idea is that companies, organizations, artists and so on stop thinking of themselves as being their own red line and start to see themselves as having a bigger kind of energetic kind of idea which they're all part of.
You probably have speakers once in a while who come to your meetings who have a lot of ideas, theories, visions. What we love about Mark is he's actually done the things he's going to tell you about, and he's actually going to show you numerous examples, not just one or two where we tried it and this seemed to work, but numerous examples of where this new approach to city making has become transformational.
So Future City, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the agency. I had an experience about 8 years ago as an art consultant that was really quite terrible. You know, I went into a big property developer meeting, and we was a table of 30 people, and around the table there was the master planner, there were the landscape architects, and so on, all around the table. We all went round and introduced ourselves, and then it got to me, and I said, "Oh, I'm Mark Davy, I'm the art consultant," and there was a sort of deadly silence, and the tumbleweed blew up and down and the bell tolled, and I realised that I wasn't really welcome in that room, because what I was going to do was spend a tiny amount of money, which we call 106 money, which is a kind of planning negotiation, on a piece of art with an X marks the spot location. That was my role. They didn't want to use the money, they didn't care, and I would provide that piece of stuff, And I kind of staggered out, and I kind of thought afterwards, actually it's really my problem. It's not theirs, because they're comfortable in the world they have. They have a structure and they have a way of delivering property, and the arts are a kind of irrelevance. And I kind of went back, and there was only 4 of us then, and we just sat down and we really looked at the kind of different models, and we just felt that what we would do is restructure ourselves. Anyway, 8 years on, there's 20 people, and we're doing the biggest regeneration projects certainly in the UK. We're now working in Sydney on some major projects there, and I think we've crept our way up the feeding chain from that art consultant at the bottom to advising, in some cases, the master plan before architects come on. So, and what's changed has been this. It's been the idea that cities are, as you know, cities are changing in terms of what they're for. The notion of a city is now a whole range of things. It's a playful place. It's a place of well-being. It's a place of density. It's a place where a kind of transient population is on the move. But it's also a place where increasingly cities around the world are competing for quite similar things. They want the tourists, they want the inward investment, they want GE, they want Google, they want all these people to come into their cities, but they're all competing on quite a level playing field in terms of what can you offer? You can offer buildings, and you can offer some space, and you can offer maybe it's crime-free, perhaps the language is easy, the education is there. After that, what differentiates you from other cities? And this is a kind of interesting list. This is from the World Cities Forum, which is made up of 32 cities from around the world. And I just highlighted some. So if you look at Boston, is 645,000. So this group call themselves World Cities. They meet every year in different locations. They work their way around. So as Brussels are up there, they've got 175,000 people. They are a city. And they're in the World Cities Club. And right down the end, you've got Tokyo, which has 37.8 million people that make up a city. And in between, you have a whole range of different populations. So there are these clubs emerging of the world cities, clubs of cities comparing themselves to other cities and looking at their sort of what differentiates themselves from other cities around the world. Now, the big issue really is that as we get more dense, as the cities become denser, more populated places, there is a danger that effectively the identity of those cities becomes it grays, it disappears. So the role of culture is much bigger now than it ever was. You have, those of you in the room that you say are part of that cultural family, creative industries, architects, artists, artisans, whatever it is you're doing, you are part of, if you like, a new force which actually says cities are defined by their cultural identity. But if it's like London, culture is kind of owned, has always been owned to some extent by the public sector. you know, and that, going back to that meeting that I had when I sat at the table as the art consultant, I had no power, I have no kind of position, I'm not an architect, there's not a kind of name for what I do that they have one of me at every meeting. So what we've had to do is to fight to make a business case, to make a case for the context of what we do. So the art is no longer the answer. What is interesting is a kind of bigger piece of intellectual kind of thinking around the role of culture to define cities. And I think the idea of world cities using culture and placemaking to define their identity, for me, is the future. The key thing that the developers are learning in the UK, which is, if you like, a property-owning democracy, is that in the past, you built and moved on. You built, you got out. You leave a little management company, but you went. The difference now is the London's great estates, where large amounts of its real estate is owned by an organisation, has meant that they can invest in quite unusual and creative things. You no longer have to worry that the seating has to kind of conform to city regulations, that it will be cleaned by the city eventually, that everything has to kind of conform and can't be different or unusual. This is changing now, and so all the big estates there are redefining their public realm, rethinking their retail, commercial and residential offer, and the new estates that are making up these vast new changes in London means that the new developers are starting to think of themselves as the new great estates, which means they can be much more creative about the way they design, master plan, and so on. And just before this morning, I get a little sort of feed in from the BBC. This came up, and so this came up today. Creative industries, that amalgam of fashion, advertising, design, film, TV, etc., will soon outstrip the financial sector, accounting for 5% of the UK economy, £80 billion. So now the kind of evidence, the numbers are starting to prove that the cultural community, the creative industries, it will soon in London outstrip the financial district, the financial sector. So we have power and we have arts and we have wonderful brands and so on, but we don't really have any kind of representation that puts us into a room when major developments are taking place. So I'm going to show you some thinking really. So one of the things we're interested in is what we would call the growth of the rise of the creative district. So major cities, as in Boston, are redrawing the cities. New areas of brownfield sites, industrial sites are coming online. They're being redeveloped. They're changing the nature of the city. And one of the big things in London has been King's Cross. That's been redefined by a brilliant accident. St Martin's Art School relocated to this old part of London, King's Cross, and this is it here, and transformed the thinking of the developer that had the site. Suddenly you had one of the world's best fashion designers, fashion colleges, in the middle of this development, and triggered a whole series of sort of creative thought processes about what that place could be. And you suddenly found that people like Michael Pinsky, a great curator, was given a kind of access to the public realm. The arts became important. The developers stepped back a little bit and realised they had something extraordinary here, which they hadn't really planned for. What's happened? Google goes to London, new headquarters, and which should go to the City of London. All right, maybe it'll go to Canary Wharf, the new financial district, new residential district and commercial district. It doesn't. It goes to King's Cross, which isn't really an office quarter. Why? Because it's interesting, it's authentic, it's next to the British Library, it's next to the Francis Crick Institute, which is a wonderful research establishment for medicine. It's next to the Wellcome Trust. It's a creative place. It's got a kind of downtown feel. It's edgy and interesting. It goes there. So suddenly in London, what it did was almost unlock the idea that suddenly these big businesses aren't going to go to the city anymore, or they could go anywhere. So developers on the bigger areas of London start to rethink what their development can do. So the big one I'm going to show you, which is a huge project, we've been involved on and off for about 5 years, is 9 Elms. 9 Elms is 500 acres. It has 2 local authorities dealing with it, and you can see the numbers there. It's going to open up 3 kilometres of Thames public riverside. The new US Embassy is relocating there. The number, third line down, 34 property developers, each with their architects, each with their landscape architects, each with their engineers, building their red line ownership along that area. At one end, you have Battersea Power Station. If you know we're obviously famous for the Animals Pink Floyd album, but if you know London, and at the other end, you've got the Shard. So you've got the tallest, who's the architect? I can't remember, should have noticed that. The other one, you've got the Shard, the tallest building in Europe, and they're effectively bookending this line along the river. And this is a set of view. Now, if you look there, there's Battersea Power Station, 34 developers working their way up and then eventually going up to the Shard in the east, along the east of the river. A huge redevelopment for London, but one of many. Another big thing that's happened in London has been the Crossrail programme, which is a new train line, which has opened up previously suburbs of London and created the opportunity for them to be urban centres rather than suburban centres. We'll talk about that in a moment. So what we do as an organisation is we drew Nine Elms almost like a London Underground tube map. And the grey area is Nine Elms, as we drew it as a schematic. We figured put in the property developers. But what the big thing was that we joined Nine Elms to a bigger idea. These four are real. They are the Tate Modern, the South Bank, Bankside, going up to the Shard. This is all to happen. But what we were saying was it should be Nine Elms on the South Bank. It should drag South Bankness, a sort of cultural centre, down the river to Nine Elms. And a series of strategies should be developed to make this a London's creative district. And this was driven in partnership with the Nine Elms management organisation and with developers. Now, before I left, I found this this has nothing to do with us, but what was interesting was that for the first time, a developer who's created a CGI has created a view which takes you up to the Shard. So they've sort of mentally now started to see the geography of the city differently. So we're redrawing the city. And we then thought, well, this is interesting. Perhaps we could create a kind of brand of our own. This could be a future city brand. You know? And there's a great story about Highline, where the guys who first kicked off the Highline, one of the first acts was actually to go to Pentagram and have a logo designed. And I love that kind of, that usually with chutzpah. What brilliant arrogance to have a logo before you've even raised a penny or a dollar, So we did the same thing. We said, okay, we went to Pentagram. And they came up with this logo. So you've got the four chimneys of Battersea Power Station and the diagonal of the Shard. But what we were interested in, we wanted to reinforce the idea of drawing the city. And this is what we can all do. We can redraw the city. There are no rules. The shapes are what you make. The Greenway is an idea. The High Line is an idea. The waterline is an idea. It comes from connecting dots, joining up ideas, creating a momentum, building a club that everyone can belong to. And then the idea is that companies, organisations, artists and so on stop thinking of themselves as being their own red line and start to see themselves as having a bigger kind of energetic kind of idea which they're all part of. So we developed with the individual developers a series of strategies. And the strategies sort of said, well, if you have a huge amount of public realm, then maybe your strategy deals with that. If you only have the buildings, then maybe it's amenities. But something you're doing can have a cultural value. And the first one of these is Riverlight. So this is Rogers Stirk Harbour, Richard Rogers' practice. Riverlight is a residential development. It has a huge amount of public realm on the river. And what we did there was we took all the budgets for the public realm and we persuaded the developer to put lead artists into the design teams. So in this case, Simon and Tom Bloor, very interesting young artists, very interested in play and play spaces, particularly interested in sort of modernism, were allowed to work with the landscape architects, Gillespie's, on a series of play spaces which were designed almost like these old, the old paintings of the copse, the clearing. And these will grow into a series of play spaces surrounded by trees. They embedded into the hard landscaping glitter, still strips that catch the sun. So there was a kind of glitter running through the surface. They worked on street furniture, signage, wayfinding, and so on. And this is the Sky Station. So this is some of this public seating. It's a seat for lying on and looking at the sky by Peter Newman. This piece of work, this sculpture, takes the seating budget. It's toured all around the country. It's been bought by I think it's the Museum of Modern Art in Luxembourg. We've got so many requests for it to be shown in museums that we've actually have another one built so we can ship it out. So all we did was took the budgets and flipped the budgets so they did something else. So it was no longer just landscape, it was playful landscape using really interesting artists who had a collaborative role. So what we've been trying to do is establish a partnership with interesting artists who now want to be part of this new, I would say, museum without walls, a gallery without walls, a whole new area of the world which we artists and architects should be involved in. And of course, if you've seen the Turner Prize in London, in the UK recently, won by Assemble, an architectural practice. So the idea now of this kind of merging of disciplines is becoming more mainstream, and a great thing, in my opinion. You know, I want the artists I work with to work with architects, to work with engineers, to work with scientists, and to be involved in these big projects. And this is where we've been pushing in a very belligerent way over the last 7 years. The second thing we did was we persuaded the developer to give away space. So they took a commercial space, and that's now the studio called Studio RCA, and it's now a studio for the Royal College of Art, which is nearby. And that's funded, it's available, it's their space, it's to do with what they want. It's effectively an experimental space, it's not a gallery. So it's messy, the windows get dirty, and yet it's in this high-end residential development. We did a graduate program, so graduate painters and artists at the RCA worked on major commissions, well-funded, contracted, paid properly to do these wonderful installation pieces inside the buildings. And I just put in another set of slides by the same developer. And so this is Grosvenor Waterside on the other side of the river. And in this case, the artists were embedded in every part of that scheme. So Make Architects designed this residential development. The skin of the building, which is an anodized aluminium, ended up with an artist working with them on the skin of the building, the kind of surface treatment of the building, and all the details of the balconies and the fret-cut balcony details, all coming from drawings. So an artist working with artists. So really, if you ask Make or Claire Woods, who was the artist, how that relationship went, it was a wonderful meeting of equals and very successful commercially. In fact, here we are, there's the detailing. So we took the budget for the cladding and we took the anodizing process, and the artist played with it. She created this image based on the original line of trees, lime trees that were on the site that go back to the 15th, 16th century, and even kind of explored the idea of the balconies with driftwood handrails, and these balconies based on her drawings. We worked with the Tate on the Tate boat, which Damien Hirst did the livery for the Tate. This was a boat that went between Tate Britain and Tate Modern. We worked on with Richard Wilson on a sculpture, which is quite, looks quite conventional, quite brave, because inside this shiny new world, he said he wanted to put something about temporary architecture, the old allotment sheds that were by the side of the river, and he took one and cast it in aluminium and plonked it into the middle of this shiny new canyon of architecture. And we put a gallery into the space, operated by Chelsea School of Art. That ran for 7 years. There were 47 shows there, independently curated by Donald Smith, programmed with funding and ownership of that space. This wasn't a kind of dollar deal. This wasn't a kind of tax break thing. This was just a simple negotiation of saying that space could be more valuable to you by having a really interesting cultural use than it could by having a sort of mediocre business put in there. Why don't you do it? Surely you can make more money by, maybe on your residential, by having something interesting and unique inside your development. So this scheme, even the water feature, in the end was done by a German artist, Eckhard Altenberger, who worked with the engineers to create this weir piece. If you can see this here, the weir, and the water is a kinetic water piece that goes through. So every aspect of that development, from the boat right the way through to the architecture, had artists working collaboratively with the developer, with the support of the developer. No % for arts, no 106 negotiation, just a straightforward partnership because there was a common interest. So we're back, we've come across the river, we're back on our journey up the river. Here's Nine Elms, this is the linear park that's going through the centre, all these developments. This is Nine Elms, a new Covent Garden market. In the middle of the market, which is existing already, they're going to SOM Architects are redoing the whole of this market, and they're going to have a market heart. How do you define the heart of that market? Artisans, creatives making everything from street furniture to implements for eating, for food, well-being, partnerships with universities, a whole kind of mass of really interesting cultural partnerships, reinforcing the idea of this creative heart in in New Covent Garden Market. And then all the way up we have, this is another St James scheme. This is, again, Rochester Harbour. There's also a Foster's scheme there. And we persuaded them to, again, use the landscape budget to work with a fantastic organisation called Random International, an arts group. They, I think they had a big show in LA recently, but their claim to fame are the rain room pieces, in which as you walked into the space, the water that's flowing, it's raining through the space, and as you walk in, it stops wherever you are. So sensors pick your movement up, and the rain stops, and as you move through the space, it stops around you. So their first major permanent fixed work will be in the public realm at this site along the South Bank. So all the way along the river, effectively as there's redevelopment, the idea is of artists working collaboratively with the architects. In this case, this is the Wanda scheme. This is KPF Architects, who the top floor of the tower is given up to public use and has a major budget. And what we're going to do there is have artists working on the interiors and exteriors, glass, and the kind of series of projects that are linked to this top viewing platform. And then that links to a series of projects on the ground, in the public realm. And even things like Pop-Up, this is with Studio Weave, again, another interesting art and architecture creative organisation, who've been looking at a pop-up space for a series of events and entertainment and unplugged things and so on. So there is an appetite now to do creative things, to work with architects, to work with these creatives in unusual ways. And as we move up the river, we could come up past the South Bank, we're going up towards the Shard. The South Bank Tower, this is also a KPF building, did a couple of things. Firstly, we did a series of cultural mapping projects in which we looked at the kind of core area and found 30 really interesting businesses that were linked to everything from cheesemakers to loot makers to beekeepers who lived and worked in the area. We worked with Steve McCurry, who recorded the artist and catalogued the artist. We had an exhibition of the work with Magnum, used the book as a kind of study, and we released 10,000 books around in the public realm for people to sort of see where these places were. So it was a kind of the developer starting to kind of understand beyond the red line for their own ownership and plug into the community that was around them and look to them for creative ideas. And one of the ideas that came out was a challenge to take the interior, the entranceway, and take the budgets for that. And instead of having an interior architect, we had an artist selected for an international competition, Tobias Putri, who's based in New York, to do this incredible architectural intervention, which is made of thousands of anodized purple pieces and based on things that he'd found on the Thames when the tide went out on the Thames, bring all these artifacts and created this series of abstracted ideas. So that building had the artisan books, it had an arts club, it had a major sculpture commission, and a whole series of other things which came out of all sorts of budgets from build, landscape, marketing, and so on. And of course, it helps them because it's a balance between the artists getting paid and perhaps there's the marketing and PR opportunities that come with it. And then just one more project on here, and then before we get to the Shard, this was another interesting where the developer said, where am I? Where is this site that I've bought? I've bought this piece of land. Where am I? We did some mapping, and we found that within walking distance there were 15 theatres of various sizes, from pop-up above pubs to the National Theatre. And then we started to think, well, what are the businesses that are linked to theatres? So set design, prop design, textiles, food and beverage. And we found around 90 businesses that were theatre related. We went back to the developer and said, well, you're in the centre of a new theatre district, and you could be the trigger for that theatre district because your money that you're using on your community, your commercial space, your public realm, could have a strong theatre or event-based kind of feel. And you could plug into this area, and you could even create your money could be the catalyst for it. And then we're getting to the Shard. We finally arrive at the Shard, and this is where it jumps out of property development and into other areas. So it's not all about residential property or commercial property, although there is a big part. It's also about infrastructure. So this is Grimshaw's new station for London Bridge. This is a CGI of the new platforms that are being built, one of the most busiest terminuses in London. And in this case, an artist, once again, has been commissioned by the developer by the station to work on a huge intervention piece that will plug into the new railway station. The hospital that's being built nearby, this is Guy's Cancer Research Centre, has 6 artists working on everything from, this is also a Rogers building, from ambient lighting inside the main public realm areas on the different floors by Angela Bullock, upstands, jewelled upstands created by product designers at the RCA to kind of get away from the kind of utilitarian, grey, functional upstand and create something magical and exciting and interesting. And if it's successful, the royalties on that will go back into the hospital on sales. Wayfinding Commission, where Pentagram are working with Carol Martins on a wayfinding strategy to take you around the hospital. And this is Marianne Nordecker's amazing lift installation. So that's the view on the left, and on the right you have the Borneo rainforest. And as the lift moves up and down, so you move up through the rainforest as well. So you have this kind of fantasy and realities, urban and rainforest mix. So this is the lifts. It's not lifts, is it? What do you call them? Elevators. Sorry, the confusion there. And the furniture. Why does the furniture have to be bought from a catalogue? Why can't it be commissioned? This is the furniture by Gita Schwentner, a brilliant furniture designer who's created the seating for the hospital. And there's other things which I haven't put on here. So just that little snapshot. You've got the station, you've got the hospital, you've got residential development, you've got commercial space, you've got public realm. All of this is kind of moving into, this is not one developer. There is no such thing as a developer. There are different people, different companies, different funding. But what there seems to be is the sense that if you can get in there early enough and you can make this, set out the kind of context of why they should do it, these are the things that are possible. So, what's interesting when you look at the websites of these people now is how they describe where they are. The days of showing the building and the floor plates seem to be over, and what you have instead is place describing where they are, understanding the context of their new developments, because it's in their interest, because of the thing we were talking about earlier. And this is the Battersea Power Station website at the other end of the river. So, we're going to jump completely into a different area now. We're going to talk about Heathrow Airport. So Heathrow came to see us through Grimshaw Architects and said, we're not happy with the new Terminal 2, the public realm as you come into the airport. We feel we could do something better. We'd like you to do some placemaking work and so on. So we did a little bit of research, and we basically said to them, are you a London airport? And of course, well, yes, of course we are. And it's okay. Well, would you agree that London is a cultural city? Yes, it is. Okay. So when you arrive in London, you arrive in Heathrow, and I'm sure many of you here have done that, what do you encounter? Well, if you're lucky, a Beefeater, picture on the side of a grey panel. So we kind of put to them that they should take the budgets from their landscape and cladding budgets, and some of the budgets for the car park, and we made a budget of around £3 million, around, what's that in dollars, about 5 million, around $4.75 million project. We ran an international competition in which 5 artists, including two New Yorkers, Sarah Z and Sarah Morris, were asked to make an intervention that dealt with the entire volume of the space at the front of the airport, which is about the same size as the Tate Turbine Hall. The winner was Richard Wilson with this very brave kind of idea, which was to imagine that a stunt plane flew through the airport, spinning and rotating, and left a trail of kind of aluminium, a kind of slipstream behind, and then flew out of the airport at the other side. And he came in with his team, and they turned the whole of this very corporate space into this amazing studio with drawings and bits of metal and programs and guys in boiler suits, and it just destroyed this lovely kind of clean space. But it was such a crazy idea. A plane going through the middle of an airport. You could argue it's probably not the greatest of ideas, but they went for it. So we worked on the project with him. We delivered the project. Could not have been more difficult. Firstly, we were taking the budgets. Those columns were not designed for that sculpture to hang off. The Louis Vidal Airport, Louis Vidal Architects designed the airport, never imagined that in this great void there would be anything. It's a kind of blast space, it's an empty space in front of the main entrance. So Richard, not only did he have to kind of work out how to hang it off these columns, but about a third of the way through the project, we then found out that there was an issue of terrorist threats, and the whole thing had to effectively be able to move on the columns. So these great shearing bolts that meant the whole superstructure, you should be able to move without the columns being affected. So this was a great moment. So all the way through, things were kind of going on like this. And then, to make it more complicated, Terminal 2 was built inside a working airport. And at night, the low loaders bringing the sections of the thing had to come across the runways at night, because that was the only time we could get in. And we had to be novated to another party, another third party, who were building the airport on contract with all of the, as you will know, all of the liabilities and threats that come with that kind of relationship. So it was so complicated. But at the end of it, that's what we got. We got Slipstream. It's as big as a Boeing 747. It weighs 80 tons. It's slung off the columns. It looks absolutely extraordinary. It's had £30 million worth of PR. It's loved by passengers. It's a social media success. It's completely transformed Heathrow's thinking about their airport as a destination and as a place. And so a whole series of other cultural things are now happening where they're rethinking their assets. And there was a great accident. One of the things we saw, there was what are these? Thank you. We wanted to move them because they were so close to the side, to the. In fact, it's the best experience in London. You go up the side past the sculpture, and everyone films this journey all the way up the side. And it's absolutely glorious. And so at the end, I don't know if I've got the right picture, at the end you see that the only figurative detail is that bit there, which is that profile of the Edge 540 as it flies through and soars out. You get that moment at the front and then leaves the trail behind. So 2 weeks after it opens, Visit Britain release a poster in which it becomes the cultural representative of the UK in their ad campaign. Now, you know, the value of that, it came from budgets that existed. It's created all kinds of relationships and ideas within the airport. You can't, at the moment, put a price on how important that piece is for an organisation which effectively is running one of the busiest airports in the world and doesn't need to do it. They did not need to do that. So whether it's a good piece or a bad piece, the bravery of the artist, but the team, but also the airport as a commissioning body is extraordinary. And so that kind of, if they can do it, why can't anyone do it? You know, there's an airport, they don't need to do this. I'm going to jump ahead into the other infrastructure project I want to talk about, which I think might be relevant. I'm going to jump ahead just to say that these are 3 projects within close proximity of each other, which we call the Peninsula projects. So once again, we are looking at a mapping process. We want to give the developer a sense of context. We want to come up with a visionary idea. We want to explore the assets and ideas that they're going to spend money on. And Greenwich Peninsula, which is this, owned by a new developer. And so we were looking at this place as we looked at the Millennium Park in Chicago as a cultural infrastructure-driven idea. And what we wanted them to say was, forget it's a residential development, forget about it as a place in that respect. Use your assets to create a sort of series of cultural markers in the way that it was done in Millennium Park. Treat the peninsula as a sculpture park that happens to have mixed uses. And the way we did it was we looked at existing assets. These are 2 sculptures from the Millennium, Richard Wilson and Anthony Gormley, the dome, the cable car, and an art school. All nothing to do with the developer, but on there already. Appropriate them and link them into a bigger idea. And we came up with a series of their assets that they had, the wharf here that was used, an energy centre, I'll talk about this in a moment, and a huge kind of marketing centre hub. So the P5K is a 5-kilometre running track. The 5K is the ultimate charity run, using the landscape budgets, an infrastructure idea that you run this incredible sculptural journey. And it's the charities bringing people down, they're bringing their families, they're doing this kind of ultimate run. It's going to have all sorts of amazing flourishes. It's like Slipstream again. The culture box was the idea of a temporary pop-up on the old concrete wharf. We set the whole thing up. We got Shunt, to a great immersive theatre group, to come on. We used containers, and this was the opening night, really successful. It's now on its, I think they've got 3 events. And the energy centre, which is at the entrance to the scheme, we took this cost-stripped, functional box with a 50-metre chimney, and we've turned it into a kinetic artwork by Conrad Shawcross, in which it shows the energy levels as shown through the kinetic moire structure of the 50-metre sculpture, and the idea that this now shows the energy levels coming into the scheme. And this will go up later this year. So even in the marketing suite, we've then converted that into a gallery that has an independent gallery with independent curators with budgets creating a space. And then we drew this cultural map which shows all these things, some of which they own, some of which are right outside. But we started to create the idea of a creative district which would attract other users and organizations to this big idea. And that's what's happened. And this is their website, nothing to do with us. Interesting how all these things now, look, that's their bit. But all of this now belongs to them and links up. So playing the city, drawing the city, creating new shapes, using the assets that are there, creating cultural partnerships, getting people excited about belonging to a club that you've created. That is the way to do it, and that is the evidence of it. There is interest. Those developers do not have to do the things I showed you. They still sell those apartments. You know, these are extra things. And this is their website now, which none of this is to do with us. It's their things. They've got a magazine which is independently edited, and this was in the press shortly before I came out about London's Ultimate Village. So again, the PR and press and marketing. And there are more. And this is a new theatre on the other peninsula, just here, where the developers are paying for a 250-seat theatre in the middle of the development and wrapping the development around the theatre. Again, this is not a 106, this is not a negotiation for any reason other than they think it's a good idea because it creates place, and place has a market value, and they understand that that's now an important factor to designing new brownfield and industrial developments. This is Trinity Square. So this is another new development in which the English National Ballet is moved part of its operation to a new building on a brownfield site funded by the developer. So the developers paid for the EMB to move onto the new site. It's their rehearsal and storage spaces, and is at the centre of the new square. And the bridge and all the other commercial assets, the public art, the links over the river to the other peninsulas, creative districts, creative neighbourhoods, and they're working, and they're attracting the tech organisations, the people who want to live in places that are real, that have a narrative, a story that they can bring their friends to, they can talk about. So to finish, the culture line, and again, very simply, this is the new Crossrail. It's the biggest engineering project in Europe. We were asked to look at a public arts programme. We went back to them and said, we don't think you should do one, because you can't match the kind of superlatives about this amazing bit of engineering. Deepest tunnels, the biggest trains, the longest train. It was just, you couldn't even match it. So that kind of, I didn't mean it to be this, it was a kind of reverse psychology where they then got kind of a little bit hurt by this and said, well, okay, you know, we do want some public art, and maybe you could tell us some ideas of what we could do. So we came up with a strategy which was designed to attract funding. And what we did was we did little placemaking kind of vignettes of all of the 8 main stations that were new, that were being built from scratch. We matched them with 8 major international galleries. So it was a gallery per station. So Pace, White Cube, Gagosian, and so on. We then used the architecture, engineering, and lighting and public realm budgets. And we effectively then put an artist into the context to create an intervention using elements of the station. And what it became was 8 artists, 8 stations, 8 galleries, the culture line. You would go on and you would see over the next few years you'll see these 8 major interventions. And there are artists like Mikhail Rovna, who was a very tough, interesting artist dealing with migration and refugees and the flow of humanity across the planet. The most beautiful, extraordinary work. Very brave and interesting artist. This is her proposal for the station. So it's linked to the kind of flow of humanity coming through the station and being picked up by sensors, and slowly these numbers growing and growing and creating this kind of almost abstracted pattern, this flow of humanity running through the work. But if you've seen her work, it's it's beautiful, and I urge you to look at it online. And another installation piece, which you'll see the trains coming and disgorging these numbers, and then gradually these kind of algorithms pick all these numbers up and grow the numbers. So, really interesting artists, brave artists. Douglas Gordon making films for Tottenham Court Road. Richard Wright, who does these paintings that are meant to degrade and disappear. Spencer Finch, who's got the only permanent work on the High Line, dealing with colours of the sky and cloud systems. And what they've done effectively is, and that whole thing comes up in one idea. You take the assets, you think of a big idea, you join it together, you look at the politics of it, you look at artists who are kind of brave and interesting, and we want to work in this collaborative way, and you use whatever you can use to make it happen. I'll stop on there, shall I, and follow? Thank you.
I'm going to start with a question you asked, Mark, and I'm going to ask you, Chris. So why can't we do that?
We can. We can. Actually, it's. I don't even think it's a matter of money. I think it's the reframing the questions in the right way. I would posit to a certain extent that Boston tends to be a little hidebound. And that I tell people we're an interesting state. We can be very progressive, and yet we're still a Puritan state, and Puritans really don't like to do things differently. But in terms of looking at places, I think you're getting some of that in the Seaport District. You're getting some of that in the out by the museums. And people really starting to understand that quality of placemaking. We have been left with some of it. I mean, I would posit that when they tried to take the Citgo sign down and they weren't allowed to, that Boston sort of has a residue of placemaking a little bit. But I think it's absolutely possible to here. We certainly have a vibrant arts community to work with.
Karen, what gets in your way when you're trying to have the kind of impact that projects like this are having?
I mean, I think I'm still quite interested in understanding these projects and thinking about, how do we, Mark, I'd love to talk a little bit more, but like, how do you work with architects? How do you get them to bring artists on and not feel that they have to compete with them as designers? And that would be a wonderful discussion, as we're all hanging out. I mean, because that's one thing that I do feel like can sometimes be a problem, like talking to developers. And it seems like you really get developers to see themselves as curators in a way. And how do you talk to them about culture?
And Mark, I think one of the things to kind of take that piece of conversation that you've talked about along the way is your role is, in a large part, translator. We don't speak the same language, and you go to places where you aren't welcome, and you find a way to create a sense that everybody is part of it. How do you do that?
There's so many interesting things. I mean, I guess the translator bit is the key, and we came up with this term yesterday, the day before, called culturalpreneur. This kind of cultural broker, and I think what it is, you've got to be able to firstly understand the client and know what's going to be the buttons to press. And that's why we do a lot of research, mapping, and thinking before we ever go in and suddenly, suggest an idea. But what you're saying is absolutely right. What we do is we try to see the developer as a cultural brand. Mm-hmm. And in fact, recently we had a conversation with a developer, and we said, you spend money on architecture, money on advertising, money on trees, you buy glass, you buy, the money you spend on creative stuff. And yet you do not see yourself as a cultural or creative organization. And in fact, if you kind of joined all this stuff up and had a kind of bit of a kind of brand that looked at yourself as a cultural organization, you would be amazed at what you could get. That marketing suite that we looked at, people are spending 5, 10, 15 million pounds on marketing suites and trashing them. But imagine a young architectural practice or arts and architectural practice saying, build me a temporary structure. And what can you do with it? You'd be theatre, it'd be cinema, it would be community, and it could still be a marketing suite. So I think it's trying to understand the client, trying to do a lot of work before so that when you go in, you sound like them. You almost want them to go, oh my God, I'm hearing myself here. And in some cases, we've very unashamedly stripped out a brand, their mind maps on the website, and the colours and the fonts and everything, and literally played it back to them, but doing a P5K, and they nod, and they're saying, yeah, it sounds like us. So I think it's doable.
Actually, I just want to jump in because one of the things that you had talked about is the question of what is value.
Yeah.
And I think that trying to change what people's concept of value is in terms of what's important. Back when I taught some architecture, I used to start with, so what's the most valuable property in New York City? And people would come up with World Trade Center, but it literally is Central Park because it actually gives value to everything around it. And I think that is a change there in terms of getting to people who see value on a ledger sheet, and then all of a sudden having to rethink that value. Well, sometimes value is just that life that you bring into that. So,
Karen, you work in the context of government, and I want to bring government to the table since we got 3 people here who work in government, sorry. And twice you said, we didn't do this because of Percent for Art. We didn't do this because, the developer didn't do it because they had to. And we took, Mark drove him around the seaport today, and Jay Padgett, are you still in the room? Maybe he left, was talking about, well, there's some little art spaces in some of these buildings because it's required by some law that if they're going to be so close to the water, they have to put certain percentage space. I mean, isn't that limiting? Then all we have to do is the minimum. If we get 0.5%, well, we'll do 0.5%, or if there's a cap, we'll only do up to the cap. But those aren't going to be transformative. Do sometimes we get in our own way by legislating things like that?
I mean, I wonder, at the event yesterday, I was wondering, do you see Percent for Art as a completely outdated tool? I would say that, and I mean, I think my other question for you is how do you, without that, how do you protect the art and the artist from becoming sort of PR campaign tools for either the developer or the government? I mean, you both referred to the Seaport District, not the Innovation District, which was, sort of this idea of reimagining the city that we had that didn't necessarily take by the community.
I mean, to answer your question, I think you're right. I mean, there is a danger that artists get used as PR tools and the work is somehow diluted or devalued. And so we have to work quite hard for that not to happen. So I'd like to think that the artists that you saw there, and there are many, and I checked before I left how many artists we're working with, and it's 180 across our projects. I'd like to think that none of them would actually come back and say, in some way I feel devalued or cheapened. But I do think it's a problem, and that you have to fight it. And we resign from as many jobs as we win. So we won't, because we've only got one go at it. I mean, I persuaded the Royal Academy schools recently to take a new space in a development. And, if that goes wrong, we'll never work with them again, and they'll tell others that we're difficult to work with and we've used them. So we've had to be quite robust, quite belligerent. And the other thing I think is the type of artists that want to work in this situation. I mean, I'm going to be provocative here and say that the artists sometimes are their own worst enemy by kind of isolating themselves off from things and kind of creating a mythical idea of that's not real money, that's not the money I can use. I'll use that money because it comes from the state fund, or it's it's kind of clean money, but I won't use that money because it's the developer's money or it's someone else's money. As far as I can see, the arts have always worked with interesting organisations, whether it's the state, the church, merchants. The gallery system is completely driven by the art market and so on. So I think you've got to be a little bit more. We've got to be more sophisticated and say we can't be used and abused, but at the same time, there's some incredible opportunities out there. And I said the other day actually about I always wanted to be first. I want artists to be first in the queue. I don't want to be the last one in, like I was 7 years ago. I want to be at the front. I want the bridge. I want the 1,000 trees. We recently had a project where there was 1,000 trees being planted, and I asked this sort of really dumb question, which was, does it matter in what order you plant the trees in? And everyone just looked at me in this room, and I said, well, it could be a land artwork. Could it be a spiral of oak trees? Does it have to be in random lines? I don't know. I'm always going to ask the dumb question, and then I'm going to try and magpie grab that thing and then give it out to arts people. So,
Chris, to what extent is risk aversion, is that part of our Puritan ethos here? Is it just sort of the nature of, color within the lines because it's more expensive to go out of it? Or how does risk play into our ability to do this?
Well, I actually think certainly in architecture, risk. How many architects in the room? Okay, liability insurance. What sort of do you think? What keeps you up at night when you do things and when you want to take that when you want to take that jump a little bit, do you worry about how that's going to come back at you, whether or not, on its most easy level, whether or not it's value engineered out, but on its worst is that it sort of flows back at you. And so I think that risk is a huge problem. And then particularly as you get older and further up in a firm, risk becomes more and more important. And sort of more deadly to the process. So I think one of the things that I really like about what I see Mark doing is the ability to help other architects manage that risk, which is huge.
To answer, and in fact, your earlier question is, firstly, the percent for arts. There isn't really a percent for arts in the UK. Bristol, I think, has some, and Cambridge, London doesn't. We have a kind of unwieldy thing called 106, but that doesn't work very well because it's kind of basically a cash settlement between the developer and the local authority. But if it's a very poor borough, that money's not going to be used on art. They've got everything from children's kindergartens to, you can imagine that it's on the shopping list. The richer boroughs tend to use it because they have got more money, and so they get more art, the poorer boroughs get less. So we don't really have it, but even if they did, I do think there's a worry that by isolating the money that's for the art, it gets everyone off the hook. And suddenly it's a bit like, well, I've done the 106 now get off my back. Whereas a lot of those projects, getting the P5K or the Slipstream project, none of that's 106. It's just talking, arguing, negotiating. And the other point really was also about liabilities. One of the things as a business we had to do was suddenly take on this extraordinary liability insurance. Of 10 million, 15, $20 million liability. So now we are able to go in with Arup and Foster and Grimshaw and others to co-bid for things because we can now take the risk on. So we take the risk on often for the artist, which is quite scary.
In terms of your conversations with developers, are there a set of metrics that you're sharing with them now in terms of their return? Is it happiness quotients? Is it participation? Is it value? Where are the value adds that can show them that there's a continuum of benefits that accrue from this kind of design?
I think it's a good question, and it's still not easy to put a really hard-nosed value on those things. We have a kind of value system that would go community value, planning value, marketing, brand and PR value, and a monetary value. So we would be looking at and it would be different from every development. So for instance, in a brownfield site, there may be no community because there never was a community and there's nothing nearby. So in that case, the value might be around something else. It could be a PR and marketing value because it was suddenly put, like Greenwich Peninsula, suddenly makes it an extraordinary place that it wasn't. And so it varies. But we are aware of values, and we do have to be quite robust about that. The second part of the question really is that we do work really hard to create a very compelling idea or argument for that developer. And as we've got bigger and we've done more projects, it has got easier to be able to go into a room with a developer perhaps we've never worked with before, and as they're being cynical or as they're kind of just shaking their head and looking like you should be removed from the office, you can just go, well, we did this one for a big housing association, this was public housing, this was a commercial district, this was, and you could just keep knocking. What's that game with the, thing you knock? Whack-a-mole. It's like whack-a-mole. You kind of just have to keep at them and kind of beat the arguments out until eventually they're kind of ready to talk. So we try that. It's a kind of cultural whack-a-mole, whatever that is. There's a new game there.
Hi, again, Mark, thank you. What struck me tonight is maybe the critical beginning point for your process is mapping. That you begin with that. And it's mapping not only the physical assets, but also the intellectual assets, the potential assets, et cetera, but starting with that as something to take to the developer, something to take to the city, et cetera, et cetera. But and mapping I'm using in as elastic a sense as possible. It's not only physical mapping, it's also, thinking, what are we really ultimately aiming for? Because I was trying, as I said last night, to figure what is your ask? What do you take to the first person you go talk to on Monday? And I think maybe what you take to that person is a map.
That's true.
I don't know if you mentioned it today, but yesterday you mentioned a project Bible for one of your projects.
Yes.
And is that something you do, and sorry, sure you can explain what it is, but is that something you do on all your projects?
We would always, yes. I mean, the project you're referring to, yesterday I talked about a project in Cambridge, which was on a greenfield site. So, you understand the term, we use the same terms as you, but greenfield is farmland, and Cambridge is going to double in size, and they have this new area called the Southern Fringe, which is a huge redevelopment. It's Cambridge Biomedical Campus, which is made up of a whole series of major blue-chip kind of hospitals, and then a huge residential area, which is going to be housing. And we got involved in that. But the first thing we did was we worked with the local community, which there was a big community there called Trumpington, and we created a project Bible. And so what we did was effectively we interviewed them, we ran workshops, we recorded ideas, we took local history, and we created a really thick, beautifully illustrated, interesting book that we then gave to the developers and all the designers. And then a whole series of projects have come out of it, in which, again, the same sort of thing of the lead artist working with the design teams. And it's affected everything from street furniture, play spaces, the names of the guy. They found the names of the farmers who used to till the fields, and those are now painted onto the sides of buildings like the old signs you see, Victorian kind of signs. So the project Bible is the key, and we do that on most of the projects. And if we don't do that, we do the mapping. And so the one thing I can say is you've got to get away from that red line idea. And I never understood, it's funny, I understand the term red line. There's a story that when ropes, the Navy made ropes, they were really worth a lot of money. It took so long to make, and they were stolen. So they put a red line, a thread, through the rope, so that if they found the rope and they cut it, they could see that it was their property. And I understood red line as a continuous idea that isn't broken. But the developer, of course, and the red line is what I own. It's the shape of my land. So we're interested in a kind of secondary red line, which would cover other influencing factors on that site.
Of course, there is another meaning of redlining in America, which means keeping people out.
Oh, really?
That's my question. So my question around this is, there's a danger zone with working with developers, because they don't really want to see me, who can't afford their luxury. Most artists can't afford to be there or have our spaces get taken up from the warehouses, so we don't have places to create. And in Boston, the reason why we can still get at the water line is because by law, the public has to have access. If they didn't, I wouldn't be able to get near it. No. And the artist in Fort Point, who was the artist division, had been fighting to make sure we have that access. So my question to you, since you're in a place, and we're dealing with this now, particularly in Massachusetts, that we're losing people, how do you get developers to think, how do you make it so everybody can have culture? Because it would be great to have public housing. I know Medicine Wheel's been doing work with the public housing there with the designers to make sure folks who live there have a beautiful environment. How are you having that conversation? Because we just got voted the city with the highest polarized ends of income here, and we're losing people because people who can't afford those places can't be there. And there's a number of folks of artists, I can't be there, and a lot of my friends, particularly communities of color, are not in that conversation. And also, the artists who are getting these gigs are at a certain level. How do we make sure that folks who are just starting out can get in that game? And I think that's important to think about too. So I'm just curious how you're approaching it, because London's facing this too. I have colleagues.
Well, when you've got 30 minutes, you can only show so much. So I can, the artists I've shown it to make a point on the scale of what we do. I mean, we're working with hundreds of artists who are not Brian Gander and so on. And we work with universities, we work with studio complexes. We've just put 90 studios into a new development for a 5-year program. So, obviously, it's in our interest for artists to be in the city, and that's something that's happening across the world. It's in Sydney where we're working. It's in London. Artists in London are moving to Berlin to get cheaper space, not just going to other cities in the UK. There is a limit to what we can do, but I'd like to think that we're icebreakers. We're pushing into areas and we're having debates that wouldn't even have happened 4 or 5 years ago. But that's where you want the city supporting you, isn't it? Because the city has to wake up and say, culture is a good thing. We think that this city is going to be defined by its cultural identity. That means cultural people in the city, and that's what I'm saying. We've got to have much bigger, more intelligent arguments, but based with some real stats and information. And that's why we've been looking at this idea of the creative districts instead of just individual housing and so on.
And I do think that's something, sorry, Lamarchi, that we're thinking about a lot at the city, and how do we do that? And it's, at the Art Commission, so I run the public art program for the city of Boston. So in what ways are we urging gentrification when we're putting forth projects? And how do we keep that balance? And how do we also have the conversation of affordable housing, really, and make sure that we're not pitting art against culture, and sort of, design against art. So how do we do that? And I think, part of that is changing the way we're understanding what public art is, and is it always physical? And the mayor had some great announcements last night, $1 million to the arts, money toward artist grants, expanded artist in residency, and an artist resource desk. And we're very excited about that, and really looking at civic and social practice as a means of public art as well. And how do we keep, the politics in public art and keep those questions, and keep listening to, people like Kathy, people like Kate, people like Lamarchi, who are, active artists in our city.
I want to say that there is also, I will say, being someone who works with laws right now, a big danger in using laws because they may keep some of the worst things from happening, but they also tend at the same time to cut off the more innovative things at the other side. So they're very, very blunt instruments. And so when you put something in place and say, well, this is the number of people that need to be there to make it all work, you essentially are sort of stultifying the process. And it needs to be a process that moves, needs to be able to change and sort of grow. The question is how do you keep that conversation going about what's important in place? And that question about co-opting artists becomes very important. Are they the window dressing, or are they actually part of that community? So,
I mean, there was one thing that happened recently in London where the deputy mayor for planning and the deputy mayor for culture stood side by side and talked about the importance of those two areas now in all new redevelopment in London. So that was a good thing, and there was an interesting debate, which was master planners, architects, developers, and the cultural community were in the debating chamber at the GLA in London. So I think there is an understanding, but there is also the problem. Which I agree with you, which is, if it's public money that creates the spaces and holds them, then how do you vet who's in there, and what's the tenure, and how long are they in for, and why are they there and no one else? And you do get some really seriously difficult areas when it's the state funding the studios. I don't know the answer, but I do think it's an issue.
Last question.
Okay, thank you so much, and Mark, thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing him. So my I wonder. I'm Marie Sorensen with Sorensen Partners Architects and Planners, and with Artifactory and an artistic studio as well. And I wonder if what you're doing could actually happen in Boston. There are so many amazing artists. London is an art capital. Clearly, the people there have an appetite for art. A couple of questions about the interface between architecture and art, and I wish there were more architects present here in the audience. I see a number of artists, definitely some architects, but I would have liked to see more hands raised. I personally have this branding problem where I actually tell people I'm an artist exclusively sometimes, and then I say, oh, and I'm an architect and I can build that. Or I just tell people I'm an architect, and then if they seem like they have the appetite for something more, I'll tell them I'm also an artist. But I do worry about the landscape budgets because plant diversity is an enormous issue, as well as economic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and meeting those needs. There's also ecological diversity, and so I hate to see landscape budgets just being drawn there. There's another phenomenon that I've heard about here in the Boston region where public art budgets are actually, in very certain cases, being given to architecture firms. I just refer to NADA, Nader Tarani's firm, having received a commission for public art. So I wonder, do you keep architects in your stable of people? And I think it's great. You're like a gallery curator, but the city is your gallery. So great.
It's actually good because what you were saying just now, which is we have a kind of fairly checkered relationship with all the design professionals. So sometimes, we'll work with a practice and they hate us with a vengeance because we're kind of taking things out of the pot and isolating them. And we're never usually appointed by architects. We're appointed by the developers, I want to be that case because I always want to have a separate. I don't want to be. By the nature of architecture, I always think of it as a kind of triangle. At the top is the vision of the architect, the problems of the architect's got to face, which are legion, and so on and so on. And then what happens is everything gets subsumed underneath. The landscape, the interiors, the art, and so on. And the trouble is when it's under the ownership of the architects, I think there's a danger that it becomes rationalised and kind of simplified to suit the bigger picture. When you're outside of that, it's great because then you can have an argument, you can fight it out. But I think what we've found, I mentioned many of the practices like SOM, KPF, Grimshaw, Foster, Rogers, and so on. We've worked with big practices, and I think it's always about individuals, and it's about them feeling that their territory is going to be enriched or more interesting. So we do try to broker those relationships, but invariably there are problems because the more egotistical the individuals around the table. Working with star landscape architects, someone like Martha Schwartz. If you've worked with Martha, Martha sees herself as an artist. And, when we come in and start trying to put art in her art landscape, there's trouble, as if you've got that on the camera. And, and it's the same with architects. There are certain architects who it's almost impossible to work with because they just see what they're doing as art. But then I guess it works the other way. If you get a major artist coming in, they're going to have the same issues. But it's also, my dad would call it small beer. In the end, what I'm showing you 1% of stuff that we miss 99% of what's out there. Those are just a few things, really, in the scheme of things. So I think we're trying our best to kind of, in a very evangelical way, trying to sort of show how things might be.
Last word to Chris.
Hailing with I know about the last word, but I will say that, all of these things, architecture, art, whatnot, it's always a dialogue between a lot of different factors. The history of a site, the people who are there, the budget, and I know from the political side that the state of dialogue, certainly in this country, is very poor. You don't have conversations with people about things that go beyond a certain expertise. And around here, if you're talking to a developer, you're talking development types of things. To draw people out into a dialogue that goes beyond their comfort zone is extremely difficult. And yet that's where all of these things really work the best. And I have to tell you, getting politicians out of their comfort zone is really difficult. To a certain extent, things like this are great because people get new ideas and they go home and they say, well, I'm gonna to start that conversation on a bigger level. But I think that's just a constant battle, is to keep that conversation fresh and going constantly. So,
in terms of the demographics of Boston and its cultural matrix, and looking at London and its cultural matrix, you have people of color and African descent, and you have very rich cultural components that are in the society. And what I have found I worked with the Fairmont Indigo line with Stephen Cecil Architects, and in surveying communities and having workshops, it feels to us, as we survey people, that we are taking culture and selling it back too. I have to buy a ticket to have culture. Yes. I have to buy a ticket to sit at the table. And so if we are looking at neighborhoods that we're trying to engage in, artists from those neighborhoods, what is it that you're doing in London to raise the level of the artists that are going to participate in terms of having this kind of team structure that's with planners and urban architects and designers and all of that? What are we doing here? What can we do here to make Boston have the reflection beyond policy with that? Any of you in there?
Mark, we're going to take.
Well, I'll start by recognizing La Mercia as one of the City of Boston's artists in residence. We have 10 of them, and on Saturday at the Bowling Building in Dudley Square, they'll be presenting their proposals for 6-month-long residencies at the City of Boston, which is, I think, something we're doing. But I think, as we are talking about sort of artists operating at a global scale, it is really concerning to think about what does that mean for the local culture and how do we sustain that? What does that mean for local artists? And we're, here we talk about being a world-class city. Sometimes I'm not quite sure what that means. I'd love to hear what that means to you. But how do you have a world-class city and also have a thriving, talent pool within that city that grows, that is shown by the local museums, that get jobs here? How do we grow our homemade culture?
Well, I think that for me, it just comes back to this real problem of what I would call compartmentalization. Yeah, I've come into a very specific area. It's a very small part of the world, and we're not funded. We're not a government agency. We're a business, and we've really deliberately taken the role of being a business. I mean, I go in to a meeting and I fight to get high fees. I fight to get money because I'm sick of being the old artist putting my paintings on a restaurant wall, and if you sell my paintings, I give them to you for free, and if you sell them, I'll make some money. This forelock tugging, when I had a forelock tugging sort of apologist thing that we have to go through is pathetic. And so I've very deliberately taken quite a belligerent position as a business and said, we'll charge money, we'll make money, and we'll give them something amazing. And so I'm really interested in, artists have to step up to the plate as well as everyone else and say, there's a world out here, we will want to access it, there's stuff for us to take, but what do we look like? And that's how I felt that day when I went out into that meeting and thought, God, it's not their problem, it's my problem, because I just look strange, I sound strange, my aspirations are mad compared to the people I'm talking to. Now, I mean, whether I'm a better person, I probably need some serious help now, actually, but, I don't know I'd recognise myself from 7 or 8 years ago, but I go out there and I fight for stuff, and I think it's there, but we are in the art community, I think, need to be braver and stronger and pull together and merge with architects as well. Because, as I say, I'll go back to Assemble, who won the Turner Prize. That's an extraordinary state of affairs where an architect wins a major arts prize, and they won it for their community project, where they were working with the local community and pop-up and temporary architecture. So look, it's probably not a better time, weirdly, to do kind of extraordinary things.
So sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I just would like.
Although the rule of a great presentation is leave them wanting more. So I actually am going to wrap it up on the third try because we have been running Mark ragged, and we're going to continue to do so, and we want to have that opportunity. Thank you very much, Mark, for addressing this. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for coming and for your great questions.
2012, we taught 20 girls. And I would say probably 80% of those girls came from families that were under the poverty line. Probably half of them didn't have a computer at home. More than half of them didn't have a computer at home.